Morning, everybody. So we're continuing on in Hilchos Yichud. Page 18, we discussed that a bayich shapischo pasuch l'shus ram. If you have a house that the doorway is open to l'shus ram, the Mechaber says in Siman Kaf Bey, it's quite well known, ein chashash l'syachid sham avera. There's no problem of being in seclusion with an erva, let's say a married woman who's not your wife, and not your mother, obviously, or your sister. There's no problem of being in the house as long as, to use the words of the Mechaber, he's quoting off of a Gemara, the doorway is open to the public domain. Now, what constitutes a doorway open to the public domain is the subject of a lot of machlokas, which is very relevant today. Especially today in many buildings, what do we have on the wall, on the ceilings over there? We have those entities called cameras. So if we understand what Pesach, Pasuch, Rosh Hashanah, we could try to figure out the entire situation. So Rabbi Akiva Eger on page 20 quotes the Rashba. The Rashba says that Ein ze yichud ad she'abayis no'o b'mano. If you have a house that opens to a public domain, and we already discussed that a public domain does not necessarily mean Rosh Hashanah for Shabbos, but rather anywhere where there's people go to, it doesn't have to be that the door is open, rather that the door is not locked. So as long as you're in a house where the door is not locked, even if you're alone in the house with someone who is an erva, according to this Rashba, it would not be yichud. Unbelievable heter. Pesach Pasuach does not really mean the door is open. Rather, it means the door can be opened. However, Rabbi Akiva Eger himself says, "Aval be'emes zehu lesa." You see the paragraph near the gray on page 20. This isn't true. He says the Davka Pesach Pasuach. He says if you read the words of the Gemara in Kiddushin, it's literally the door has to be opened. And therefore, if the door is closed, even if it's not locked, that is going to be yichud. That's going to be yichud. He quotes a case in the Gemara where you have two rooms, one within the other. The men are in the inside room, the women are in the outside room. There could be a problem of yichud if one of the men goes into where the women are, and so on and so forth. He says, well, if it's only an issue of lock, then what's the problem? He says, no, it's got to be that even if it's not locked, it's a problem of yichud. Now, the Ridvaz over here, he lived relatively contemporarily, the early 1900s. He discusses an interesting thing about yichud. He said, what is the principle of yichud? Look on page 21. What is the overarching principle of yichud where the second paragraph for the gray is on the first column? The geder of yichud is if you're alone in a private place where if you try to be intimate with the woman or vice versa, that you would not be embarrassed. He says if anybody could see them, a normal person would be embarrassed. As I've said before, the Hilchos Yichud are for normal people. We're not dealing with abnormal people. And therefore, if there's any scenario, it doesn't necessarily presumably mean that there's a Jew there. It's not true. It has nothing to do with Jews versus non-Jews. As long as there's someone there, then ein chinami, even if it's a servant or something like that, then it's not yichud. So he points out, let's say you have two people in an area where it's not locked, but it's a secluded area where no one's going to go there, then ein chinami, it would be yichud, even though you're technically not alone in a room. And he explains, if you go to the end on page 22, the end of the tshuva, he explains, therefore the Rashba is correct, but in a certain sense. The Rashba said, if you remember, Rabbi Akiva Eger didn't like it, that if you're alone in a room, as long as it's not locked, it's not yichud. He said the whole nakuda is as long as you're afraid that someone else is going to come in there. Because if it's not locked, you're afraid that someone else will come in, shelo b'rshus. And if the whole geder of yichud is that someone may see you and therefore you're not going to do anything you shouldn't do, then as long as there's a scenario where someone could see you, would not be yichud. L'mashal, even if you're in a locked house, okay? But there's windows that open up to the street, and you're in the living room, and there's windows, the bay windows that don't have a curtain that open up into the street. According to him, it won't be yichud. You won't do anything because you're afraid that someone's going to see you. And therefore, he agrees with the Rashba that the door doesn't have to be locked. But he classifies a little bit. It has to be a scenario where you're not afraid, where you're afraid that someone is going to walk in. Now, we could question, does that apply in our homes? Because in most homes, you don't march into someone's house even if the door is not locked. That's considered socially off, as my kids would say, SO, socially off. So you don't do that. Now, there are some cultures or places where you do that. I do believe that in certain bungalow colonies, upstate New York, it is the practice that people march into other people's bungalows without permission. But certainly where we live in West Hempstead, Long Island, I don't think we would go into each other's house even if the door is not locked. The marshal, even if you go on Shabbos to visit someone and the front door is open and the screen is closed, even if it's a clear screen, you knock on the door first. I think most of us do that. I don't know if you do. Before you walk in. You don't just walk in. That's stam. That's not to a yichud. That's right. Stam. You stam, don't go into a house and knock. But I mean, you stam would walk in. So he's saying, but if it's a scenario where the door is not locked, but someone would come in, then eina chinami, it would not be yichud. And this is a big discussion. It's a big discussion. Now, on a modern sefer on page 25, the Chazon Ish was quite mekel, as was Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. They held like the Rashba, that even if the door is not locked, it's not yichud. And they took it even a little bit of a step further than the Ritva. They said, even though it's true that be'etzim someone is going to knock before they go in, but l'maisa, you're afraid someone may knock and come right in. And therefore, in such a situation, it's not yichud, provided there are people going back and forth. So he mentions until 10 o'clock at night. Afterwards, it would be yichud because it's no longer Pesach Pasuch Rishus Harabim because there's no Rishus Harabim there after 10 o'clock at night. That's a separate problem. But before 10 o'clock at night, he seems to be lenient and says if the door is not locked, okay, they'll knock. But l'maisa, they're going to come in, and therefore it's not a problem of yichud. And many others were mekel. The Stipler also was mekel in this type of a situation, and it's not yichud. Now, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky wrote a sefer Emes Liyaakov, and it's on page 27. It's an interesting sefer. He discusses a bunch of issues. But in the very end, in a footnote, he discusses yichud, and he sort of has a hybrid shita, and this gets to what you were talking about. He says, Izazoy, if it's a case of yichud de'oraisa, then he says one should be machmir against the Chazon Ish, like the Rebbe Kiva Eger, that that the door has to mamish be open. If it's yichud d'Rabbanan, then you could be mekel. And even if the door is not locked, it's not a problem of yichud. Open. Open means open. Open means open.
It can be not latch.
No, open means open. So, where is this nogel l'maisa? So the truth is, we learned this already, with the most prevalent application of this shaila is a cleaning lady. Most of our cleaning ladies are not Jewish folks. That's just how it seems to be. And The halacha is that yichud with a non-Jewish woman is only midrabanan. It's not asur min Torah. Shammai and Hill, they're based in Regozeret. And therefore it's yichud drabanan. So with the cleaning lady, he would seem to hold we certainly could be lenient. Remember, the Chazon Ish is lenient even yichud doraisa. But he holds yichud drabanan. The door is not locked, it's fine. Even if it's not open. It's a common application of this heter. Another case of yichud drabanan is a man with two women. According to all circumstances, we would agree that's yichud drabanan. Even if one is going to be, right, it's yichud drabanan. Yichud doraisa is only one man and one woman, even though we cannot be in seclusion with two women. 3 yes, 2 no. But you yichud drabanan. So if the door is closed, even if it's not locked, it's certainly not a problem, even if you agree machmir like that. That's Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Yes?
If a cleaning lady's married, is that...
It's a very interesting question. That's a very interesting scenario. I don't know if you remember, we brought the Minchas Chinuch that says that since there is a concept of marriage by a there is a concept of marriage by a non-Jewish person. The Davak Be'ishto was said to the world. It wasn't just said to Jews. In fact, as a Tosfos, it's not so pashut a non-Jewish person could get divorced. It's pashut they could be married. It's not so pashut they could get divorced. I mean, there's a major religion that believes that also. So, but leaving that aside, so you could have, and it pashtus, even though there's a v'davak bishto, that's only an isur aseh. It's not a lav. It's a transgression of an aseh, if you follow what I mean. In other words, you're transgressing the aseh v'davak bishto.
What's that say?
That you need to stay with your wife and no one else's. For a non-Jewish person.
But what relations with married non-Jewish woman wouldn't be a lotase?
No, it's a the way the Minchas Chinuch understands it, it's a lav that comes from an aseh. In other words, you understand what I mean? And it would be the same thing, by the way, right? It's a lav that's derived from an aseh. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay, so it's an interesting thing. There are those that say that's doraisa. Pashtus, you can make it rabbanan, especially in light of the tshuva of Moshe. Even Ezer, page 28. Dr. Moshe. B'Pesach pasuch l'shus ram, where the gray is. Kvar bayarti, I already explained that even if the door is locked, he's going to be more mekel even than the Chazon Ish, my friends. Keved shederech kol alma, the way of the world is when you hear a knock on the door or the doorbell rings, and you go to the door and say, "Who is that?" And lamaisa, you're going to open the door if you have any inclination, you know who the person is. There's not a problem of yichud. When it's a scenario that people are likely going to come and knock on the door. He says, because you're going to be afraid. Imagine if someone knocks on the door and they know there's a person there and you don't answer for 20 minutes. It's going to look weird. But you're going to be nervous to come to the door in a state that doesn't look like it should be for 10 o'clock in the morning. So he says that's a tremendous kula that he brings down. He says, if you're in a place where people normally don't show up, don't knock on the door, then ain't a chinami. Then you need to actually have the door open, mamish open. But if it's a place where people normally knock on the door, so there's no problem. L'mashal Shabbos here, people visit, so they normally knock on doors, for sure. Even during the week. The Amazon guy comes, right? People here order from Amazon. Usually they knock on the door. Okay? And he says that this would not be the case in a place where they don't knock after a certain hour at night. Marshall, even here after 9 o'clock at night, maybe there's people in the street, but you don't normally knock on people's doors at that time. So if that's the case, this door has to mamish be open to the street. Has to only be in a scenario where people normally knock at a time where people normally knock. So even though there's people in the street here maybe till 10, 11 o'clock, certainly it's unseemly, I think, in our society to knock on people's doors after 8:30, 9 o'clock by derech klal. And at that point, your mamash would have to have the door open. In other locales, it would be different. There are places where it is common to knock even late at night. And that's how he seems to paskin. That's how he paskins. So, according to Rav Moshe, you have a big heter. The door could even be locked. Even by Yichud Doraisa. He doesn't make a chiluk between Doraisa and Durabanan, my friends. Big heter. What about video cameras? Well, if you go to the Shas Chuvas or Advaz that the source of video cameras, the source of Yichud is that no one will see you. With a video camera, you may be mirtas, someone will see you. Certainly there's room to be lenient with Yichud Durabanan with a nanny cam. Okay, with video cameras. A lot of people that have housekeepers here have video cameras. And you know that today people look at them on their phones all the time to see what's going on in their house. Right? Especially people who have little kids or they have elderly or sick people in the house, and b'derech klal, they put video cameras everywhere. Right? So, l'chora, there's certainly room to be lenient, especially with Yichud D'Rabbanan. Yichud D'Oraisa, that's another story. But with Yichud D'Rabbanan, where it comes in, is mamish video cameras. So there's a makom to be lenient. It's based on the Shas Chuvas Ravas. Okay, everybody should have a wonderful day, and we'll continue with the next big heter tomorrow.